get started. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see so much interest in this transit talk. My name is Matthew Sutherland, the Advocacy Director with Transportation Choices Coalition, and I will be your moderator today. Today's transit talk is hosted by Transportation Choices Coalition. We are a policy and advocacy organization in Washington State that works to bring people more and better transportation options that are healthy, sustainable, and accessible. Transportation Choices Coalition would like to take a moment and acknowledge that while we are gathering today virtually, our panel is joining us from unceded lands in the Pacific Northwest. We're calling in from the tribal land of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish and Spokane people, and we are dropping a resource in the chat. I invite you to learn about the land you are on and welcome you to acknowledge it in the chat as well. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out a few things about our virtual space. We have enabled captions for this event. If you would like to show or hide the subtitles in the main room, you may do so using the options at the bottom of your Zoom screen under live transcript. Please use the chat to ask questions and expand on discussion topics. Of course, please be respectful to the panelists and each other. You can send questions in the chat or privately to McKenna Lutz. This webinar will be recorded and shared with you once it is available. I'd now like to introduce our incredible panel of speakers. Today, we are joined by Representative Emily Alvarado from Washington's 34th Legislative District, Jack Archer, an organizer with Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane, Anoka Herat, Police Practices and Immigration Council with the ACLU of Washington, and Vicki Clark, Policy Director with Washington Bikes. During this legislative session, we saw a big push in housing, land use, and enforcement work. There were many successes like the Middle Housing and Growth Management Act update bills passing, but there were some frustrations as the Free to Walk, Traffic Safety for All, Wrong on Red, and Transit-Oriented Development bill didn't cross the finish line. With Move Ahead Washington passing last year and delivering substantial investments throughout the state, we saw this year's $13.4 billion transportation budget continue to make good on those promises. We're going to post a link in the chat to a deeper analysis of the budget. We also saw many policies proposed to make roadways and sidewalks safer and more equitable places. Road systems across the United States have largely been built to favor drivers, and traffic laws have largely been enforced disproportionately against Black and brown road users. The relationship between enforcement, road safety, and equity is complex. Because of road design and disproportionate enforcement, different solutions have different needs when it comes to safety and enforcement. Our panel today will discuss how enforcement impacts safety, how road use reform aims to improve public safety generally, and how all this showed up during the legislative session. At TCC, we know that safety is a broad concept with many contexts and definitions, and we are committed to comprehensively exploring safety in its various contexts and will continue to host conversations and share information throughout the year. All right, so let's get started with our first question. Some context and background. Why are we talking about enforcement and safety together? How did this show up in the legislative session? We'll start with Anoka.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anoka Herat with the ACLU of Washington. And, when we talk about transportation or transit or movement, we're really talking about fundamental aspects of a free society, of democracy, freedom to go to temple or to school or to work or to go have fun, free from the terrifying and humiliating experience of being stopped or questioned, potentially arrested, potentially harmed by a government agent. And, with that freedom, of course, always comes sort of rules of conduct, as we have laws to balance that freedom with safety to ensure that, the ways in which we engage with the road or on the sidewalk or in bike paths, et cetera, allows each of us to enjoy that freedom. But what we see with those laws, which are mostly civil, meaning that they don't result in going to jail or any sort of criminal penalties, they usually result in citation or fine, is that they are being enforced by armed, fully commissioned law enforcement, sort of the most coercive state resource we have as a society. And traffic stops, for example, are by far the most common way that people interact with law enforcement, with police. And at any time, if we are driving on the roads, each of us is in violation. I mean, if we go 1 mile over the speed limit, we're technically in violation. So with these sort of low risk, really rules of conduct, these civil laws, there's just so much discretion. And in that discretion, officers have a choice as to when and how or who they enforce these laws against. And that's where we see bias, bias against Black, Indigenous, and people of color, bias against people who are perceived as poor, people with disabilities, et cetera. And so this legislative session, there were a number of efforts to try to rebalance that, reset that balance between freedom and safety, to ensure that all people have that ability and that freedom of movement without compromising safety on the roads, et cetera. And so those were the underlying goals and values, I think, of many of these bills. And unfortunately, these bills did not move forward this session. Although I have to say that they did move, they did move through committees. And so even that, I think, was really transformative and was a victory.
Jack, want to pose the same question to you. How did some of these enforcement pieces show up in the legislative session?
Hey, I mean, so I think about the Traffic Safety for All bill, right? And trying to reduce the number of stops, reasons that police officers could stop someone. Because, as Inoka said, that's the most common way that people interact with police. I mean, that is the most coercive tool that we have. I think about, some numbers that, I know just because of the work that I tend to do around police accountability, which is what actually drew me into this transportation focused work. We know that this time last year in 2022, US police had killed nearly 600 people in traffic stops between 2017 and 2022, April 2022. And when I think about some of the names that often get chanted, sort of like at Black Lives Matter rallies and other spaces, whether it's Duante Wright or Sandra Bland or Philando Castile, those were all traffic stop incidents. So I don't think we can really separate the issues. What we did during session in trying to advance the Traffic Safety for All bill was really just to acknowledge that we want safety for everyone involved, not just the person who may be endangering traffic by theoretically or potentially having a problem with their car, but also that person in their car. What happens to them when we address that problem? And is the way we address that problem proportional and reasonable? I think it was also just acknowledging that the way we handle traffic safety, a lot of these things, they don't rise to the level of needing that kind of force behind it. So I think about things like taillights and tabs and whatnot, that these can be life and death situations for Black and brown people, and they don't need to be. Unfortunately, I felt like during the session, as far as how that showed up, was we saw a lot of opposition from law enforcement. We saw a lot of, I would call hyperbolizing about what this law would do. About, we'll have people driving without windshields and we'll have people driving without bumpers and all of these things, when in reality, I think we're just trying to get to a healthier place where people don't have to fear the roads because of who they are.
Now, Representative Alvarado, you might have a particularly unique perspective here. A lot of us are not representatives, so wanted to hear a little bit about how safety and enforcement work showed up in the legislature, for better or for worse, from your perspective, and how those two ideas were circulating amongst your colleagues, and then also from your perspective and some of the work that you did on some of these issues.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for hosting Transportation Choices Coalition, and hello to everyone out there. Nice to be part of this panel and be with these other panelists. This is my first term in the legislature, so I only have a small bit of time to reflect upon. But certainly, I think the call of the question is right, which is issues of safety and of enforcement are complex. They, in my view, get commingled too frequently. And one and the other are always seem to be part of the same discussion, when I don't know that they have to be. For me in the legislature, that showed up a lot, specifically around my work on House Bill 1428, which was the Free to Walk bill, the House companion to Senator Saldana's bill in the Senate, that really sought to remove and reimagine our outdated jaywalking laws, which are both ineffective and antiquated. And, you know, I sponsored that legislation for 3 reasons. First of all, for me, our streets, our roadways are fundamentally unsafe. They are. We have record deaths of pedestrians. We have record level deaths of bicyclists. We have people who are killed by police and killed in other settings. So they are unsafe. The question is, what's the right solution to making them safe? And I think so often we've defaulted to a vision of trying on the margins to control behaviors, primarily of people who are walking and biking. And to me, that's not the right approach. It doesn't make sense. You know, I told this story when I presented the legislation, but I'll tell it again. I jaywalk. I know sometimes, and I imagine many other people do, when I jaywalk, sometimes I cross mid-block because it's fundamentally more safe. I feel it's more safe, and I trust people to make that decision. Sometimes I jaywalk because the sidewalk disappears, and it makes sense to cross the street mid-block. So again, we have safety problems, but I question fundamentally whether you know, looking at behavior, trying to address behaviors of people showing up in public space is the best way to get the safety outcomes that we want. 2, this bill was important to me because on the enforcement side, when we do focus on those behaviors, it is demonstrated to have a discriminatory impact. We know, and thanks to the data work done by you all and others, that those who are stopped in jaywalking interactions are disproportionately unhoused people, disproportionately people of color. And when that is the response, again, it begs the question, are we focusing on the right thing? What would it look like instead to actually create safety for unhoused people, safety for folks of color in public spaces? What would be the better way to do that? And then the third thing for me, why I was proud to sponsor that piece of legislation, but I think is kind of emblematic of the greater conversation about safety and enforcement, is because we need a paradigm shift. We need a paradigm shift. And that piece is really hard in the legislature. We argue bills in a very condensed timeline. And it's hard to help people reimagine what something might look like. What might it look like to reimagine how we make public spaces safe for all? You know, watching the reactions of this bill, just forcing people to reimagine streets that are focused on people, not cars. It's a big transition. People get quite defensive about that reimagination. And so I hope part of this conversation and what we can talk more about is the advocacy work that's really necessary to embed in our communities a new way of imagining how safety and enforcement show up.
Absolutely appreciate all the work you did on some of those bills. We know how tough it is sometimes to take big stances that are paradigm shifting, and appreciate your work on Free to Walk and all these other bills. There are a lot of other bills that Washington Bikes really championed this year in the legislature that had a lot to do with safety. Vicki, really interested in your perspective and how you saw enforcement and safety work show up in the legislature this year.
Oh my goodness, the blessing and the curse of being last, because there's the initial question and then how it's evolved from what everyone else has said. So I guess I want to throw out some thoughts in the spirit of this is an interesting conversation, right? Because so backing up a little bit, 745 people were killed while getting from A to B on Washington streets last year, mostly through vehicle collisions, but it was pedestrians and pedestrians of color who bear the brunt of that harm. And so as we approached the legislative session, it was really looking at the what are the predominant factors that weigh into those deaths? So like half of half of traffic deaths and serious injuries involve a drunk driver. I think it's a third of serious injuries and fatalities involve a young driver, someone between, I think, 16 and 25. We know that a lot of crashes happen at intersections. I think statewide it's 1 in 10, but when you're thinking about urbanized areas, it's a lot higher. For example, like Seattle is like 86% or something. It's where everybody comes together, right? And so that was really the looking at banning right on red. Specifically was a big push for us. We also had another bill to require drivers who seriously injured or killed a pedestrian or bicyclist have to retest before they can get behind the wheel. The latter bill passed. We had the right on red did not make our committee, and I think so that's the context. And I think I want to kind of jump to what some of the things folks have said, because yes, to Representative Alvarado's point around like the conversation in the legislature, it was really interesting to like have this right on red conversation, which was clearly just people's heads were exploding, I think, on some level. But I was also going to say, like, I in direct contradiction to something that you said, Rep. Alvarado, around this, like the conversations happening together and separately. On some level, I feel like they are happening. Like the conversation of like safety in this very traditional sense is happening in one way, but there's to Jack's point, like there's a really different meaning around safety, like the number of people who were killed in traffic stops. Well, how is that number different? Like, so we have the 745 number. Jack, I apologize. I had the number in my head for a while. The traffic stop number, like those things are like two of the same thing, right? And so it feels like there's so much work to do to not. It's easy to like muddle the conversation when you don't want progress to happen, I think, but it needs to be a more cohesive conversation around like what is true traffic safety. Enforcement is a piece of that. And I know, I guess the last thing I would say, I know for like the last few years, we've been talking about this and thinking about and evolving our thoughts on enforcement, and I think still have further to go. And these conversations are really cool, but then I'll kind of switch to a completely different. We had a conference a few years ago where there was a conversation similar to this around enforcement, and then immediately after another conversation with traffic engineers, and that was a whole different. Like their conversation was completely different. And so my point there is like there's so much work to do to get to evolve decision makers thinking around like what is true safety on our streets and who is impacted. That was a lot of rambling. Thank you.
A lot of great insight too. So wanted to kick the next question. We'll start with, oops, accidentally muting myself again. So we're seeing that enforcement and strategies intended to shape or curb certain user behaviors played out differently depending on the context. How do and should enforcement strategies differ depending on context? And what are the core underlying values, goals, and facets of safety that unite some of these approaches?
Who do you want to talk?
Jack,
I'm
what
happy
are your
to jump in on a couple of core values and let other people talk about some strategies. I mean, because my response to this, I think, is a little less specific on the practical solutions. My thoughts are really about what are the core values of safety. Building on Vicky's point, I believe that safety is first and foremost around making sure that people have their basic needs met and making sure that spaces are built in a way that's equitable and fair. So for me, a lot of it comes to investments and policies that give people the tools they need, that give people the foundation that they deserve, and then investments and policies that actually build an infrastructure that's equitable, that allows people to show up as they are and to use public spaces in a way that's really about public use. And I know that's a little abstract, but I think that when you apply that core value into a vision around unhoused people, for example, and their disproportionate entanglement and enforcement in public spaces, my solution would be to create meaningful safety by giving people housing and to bake that into our communities through infrastructure in a way that wasn't someplace else, but was fundamentally integrated in our communities so that people could be near their neighbors and their jobs and their services. And while not a perfect, it's a very upstream core value. I think you can actually play that out over and over again in the context of road safety and transportation and traffic safety. The same is true around pedestrian safety. A lot of talk, a lot of anxiety about people being able to walk mid-block. And yet my approach was to push through the budget the transportation investments that I advocated for as the representative in the 34th district were solely around pedestrian improvements, particularly in our most overburdened communities. To be fair, those didn't make it into the budget, which is disappointing, but I think the budget writers did do a good job of prioritizing those kinds of pedestrian safety, bike safety investments. So I would like us to continue, and this is why I talked about separating a vision of safety from enforcement, because in some world, first and foremost, we can imagine that safety comes from doing it right. Now, to be fair, we haven't. So we have to meet ourselves where we're at and try to solve for some of these nuances and intricacies. But I really want us to imagine that place where we make people whole and we make our communities whole.
Jack, what do you think some of the strategies are and underlying values and goals are for enforcement strategies, and especially if you want to talk about some of the different contexts that you see in Spokane and in Eastern Washington? I think this I remember talking to you a little bit about some of that during Free to Walk.
Yeah, absolutely. At least I can gather my thoughts a little bit. I think first off, I have to acknowledge where I'm coming from, which is that I work with and I'm a part of organizations that range in their posture towards law enforcement from reformist to abolitionist. And I tend to be more the latter end of that, frankly. I think that the way so much of what Representative Alvarado said really resonated with me about, where safety can come from doing things right? Where safety isn't just about a group of people who are being harmed by this other group of people. It's about how do we engineer the conditions in our communities where all of these people are getting their needs met. I recall some of the ways in which we've seen the strategies of law enforcement here in Spokane really change in response to the law in order to maintain the status quo. And that's been really frustrating to witness. So for me, just removing the ability to approach something from an enforcement angle to me was important, right? So to get really specific, there was a decision shorthanded as Boise, the court decision that we just refer to as Boise, which basically means that if there are not enough shelter beds, then people who are sleeping on sidewalks cannot be arrested for sleeping on sidewalks, essentially. That so long as they are not obstructing the right of way, right? Like people still have to be able to move on the sidewalks. There's no reason for them to be approached essentially by law enforcement. They can't be swept from their encampments wherever they are. People have a right to rest somewhere. In the absence of shelters, they get to pick where that is. What we saw in Spokane after that decision is that once it was determined that there were not enough shelter beds in the city of Spokane, We saw alternative ways of maintaining the status quo of sweeping homeless people. And the way of doing that was primarily through like transportation law. We saw people swept for pedestrian interference, whether or not they were actually obstructing the right of way. We saw people being swept for or being moved or arrested for things like jaywalking and vehicular interference, which are the sort very like selectively enforced things that allow the targeting, frankly, of people whom enforcement believe to be undesirable where they are, poor people and brown people, frankly, people who appear unhoused. I guarantee no one in a suit running to court has ever been arrested for jaywalking. Or at least it's probably happened very rarely. I'm sure someone will come up with a case that belies that. And I remember doing some work with our a community partner and talking about the heat map of arrests for being in camps, like people homeless sweep areas, and arrests for pedestrian interference, and seeing that it was basically the same map. So I guess, I mean, I'm rambling a little bit, but to go to the question, the context in this case of how enforcement was handled changed because the law changed, but the goal, the ultimate reaction of the structures that exist, our law enforcement and city governments, was to use a different tool to maintain the status quo. And I guess that's the only way I know how to talk about it, is how do we see this harmful status quo maintained in different circumstances. I think there's an overlying value for everyone who is approaching this legislation from either like a city angle or a lawmaker angle or even a law enforcement angle, of overall wanting people to feel safe and welcome in their communities, wanting people to feel and be able to do their tasks of daily living, to just go about their lives. But sometimes the who is in question. And I feel that sometimes when we have these conversations about safety and enforcement, we talk about the people who we talk about being safe are the housed and the economically stable and often the white. And we're not so much looking at the safety of the unhoused, the safety of the economically unstable, the safety of Black and brown people, or teenagers, or young drivers and young pedestrians and cyclists. I think that that would change how we approached a lot of these policies if we looked at safety for the whole of the population and not just the people we perceive as paying the taxes for the roads or whatever. I hope that answered your question. I'll be honest, I was unsure how to tackle that.
Hey, there's big, complex questions. I think you did great. And I appreciate the specificity and highlighting how Spokane has done some of these things. Because when we were looking at free to walk laws and jaywalking laws across the state, some of the strategies from law enforcement were different, and some of the ways in which they were targeting populations were different. So it was great to have the Eastern Washington perspective on the team. And okay, you worked on a bill that was very specifically enforcement strategy. Can you talk about that a little bit, the values and goals there, and some of the context that brought us to that bill?
Sure. Yes, I worked on the Traffic Safety for All bill, which really looked at traffic stops. And it goes back to actually some of the things that Rep. Alvarado raised, where traffic stops, as I mentioned, are very common. And so we already have a lot of data that shows millions of traffic stops. And what we see is that about 40% of those stops aren't related to driver behavior on the roads. They're more related to actually an equipment violation or something around the vehicle. And when we look at that number, that 745 fatalities on the road, and we see the sort of top 4 categories of what led to that, impaired driving, distracted driving, speeding, unrestrained passengers, et cetera, we see that those are all moving violations. Those are all behaviors on the road. And so we really, with this bill, tried to separate that out and say, for something like having one taillight out, that is not jeopardizing the safety of other people on the road. And at the same time, we have for ages our sort of as a society, our immediate response to any problem is, oh, let's punish that. Let's punish that. When ticketing someone for having a taillight out doesn't actually solve the problem, you know, and for so many equipment failures, it is targeting people with older cars with who might not have the means to actually fix the vehicle. And so even for something like tinted windows or something like that, you know, it's giving someone a ticket doesn't actually correct that violation. What it does is it entangles people into further debt, entangles people into the criminal legal system. And if someone can't afford to fix their taillight, they can't afford to fix this ticket. And it just ends up being sort of a lose-lose, you know, and these kinds of, again, low risk stops shouldn't drag people into bankruptcy or shouldn't entangle them into further debt without even resulting in more safety. So one of the components that was really important in sort of creating the traffic stops bill was to ensure that there was some sort of community fund or some sort of way that municipalities could help people to improve their vehicles, you know, in order to get safer vehicles on the road. And so the fund would help people who are low income to you know, to fix their taillights, but also give municipalities the freedom to come up with creative solutions, you know, things like taillight installation workshops, because a taillight itself might only cost $15, but it's the labor that's really expensive, you know, and so trying to teach people how to fix their vehicles, give people resources to that so that we can get safer vehicles on the road and move away from that sort of punitive enforcement, which is ineffective and again, compromises safety. And so that was one part of the idea, is just sort of moving those non-moving violations out and those equipment failures out, but still allowing discretion, because sometimes those can be, like if you have both your taillights out at night, that can be a safety, that can have a huge impact on safety, you know, and so allowing that discretion to remain for the sort of higher risk behavior. And the idea, I think, behind that is really prioritizing what enforcement we do have around those kinds of high risk behaviors that are impacting safety on our roads.
Jack, it looks like you might want to respond to something specifically, and then Vicky, you want to get your thoughts right after that.
Yeah, no, the only thing I was going to add was that as we talk about the sort of different ways that enforcement approaches vary across the state, I just wanted to mention that one of the things we see in Eastern Washington, I think, is really a more aggressive approach to a lot of these issues than people may realize, where, you know, we worried about various laws that are supposed to be theoretically about safety being weaponized actually against protesters and aid workers, people who would go to the streets to try and help unhoused people who would be in areas, would, you know, jaywalk, get to areas that didn't have sidewalks because they were going to a specific part of town to provide aid or help to that area. And there's sort of this trend that we could see where those who had the most interaction with vulnerable populations were often targeted for their efforts to help them. And I guess I just wanted to name that because I remember that specifically from being a part of the Free to Walk Coalition. And also, I guess, to lean into my position on this panel and add that I don't always think that for the enforcement is the approach for dealing with the things that we want. As Anilka just pointed out, a fine for a taillight doesn't help you pay for the taillight. It actually makes it harder for you to get that taillight fixed. And that's a huge part of the perspective that I think just has to be voiced aloud.
Okay, ready for more rambling thoughts from me? Okay. It's a really hard question to answer. I will say that. I think, what am I thinking about? We know that infrastructure and like safer streets, places where communities where people can walk and bike and don't have to drive as far, places like safer infrastructure, slower streets that just like slow people down, are the number one thing to make our streets safer. And so, you know, I think we saw some wins in the transportation budget, and that's good. It's we live in an incrementalist universe, it appears, and so it's going to take a really long time, right, to create that that future vision that we know is possible and is necessary. And so I think the conversations around how do we move away from, you know, a guy with a gun enforcing laws to camera enforcement, and how do we make sure that there's not a cop on the end, like that there's not also stop saying cops, there's not like police enforcement or the police involved in reviewing camera footage is like a lot to, and where are the cameras placed, right? Are they placed where there historically hasn't been investment in infrastructure, therefore it's in communities of color, where so then it's really a disproportionate impact on communities of color being cited. And I get to the point around, like, does a ticket, like, can people afford tickets, and what kind of financial spiral does a ticket lead to in some cases? So I think there's a lot of nuances, but there is the better way to enforce. And then I think another piece is, where is the harm, right? Like, who has the power? Makes me think about I told you, random thoughts. Early in the legislative session, as the Senate and House were rolling out their transportation safety package, I remember Senator Lovick, who was the prime sponsor on the lowering the DUI blood alcohol content level, speaking to the places where people have a choice, right? Driving under the influence is a choice, whereas driving with a tail light out, like that's not necessarily a choice, right? And the level, and I think, Anoka, you spoke to this, but like what the level of harm that has the potential to be created by somebody driving drunk versus somebody driving with a tail light out is worlds apart. Somebody jaywalking, like, what is the level of harm that they are creating? Like, again, completely different from someone driving a vehicle under the influence. And so, yeah, just thinking about like what, like, given, and again, this speaks to Anoka's point around like, where do we focus enforcement in a way that is focusing on the people who have the potential to cause the most harm.
Well, in all these situations, the end goal is to protect people from harassment, injury, death, or trauma, yet we saw many public conversations about what safety means. Vicky, I want to start with you on this one. What unexpected opposition came up during session this year to the safety bills you were working on, and what do you want people to know about in order to address some of this opposition?
I was at this is going to slightly answer that question. I think something I've been thinking about as the legislative session kind of wore on and has ended. I was at an event just last week, actually, where an elected official was speaking about numerous different issues that they were working on, and it was the kind of event where everybody, you get some really good hand clapping exercise, and there was a lot of applause for a lot of different things that are super important issues, right? And then they spoke to the traffic safety crisis, and there was silence. And I had this moment of like, oh, like this, we as a society have accepted that that driving, like having cars and driving and like being in transportation has this societal cost. When we're thinking about like very, traditional, calling it traditional, like, death and serious injuries for being in a vehicle collision, we have accepted that. And I think that is the thing that kind of sticks with me of like, and I think we've accepted, this conversation is about enforcement, right? And so we've clearly accepted the what comes along with a police enforcement as a society, right? And so I'm stuck thinking, how do we how do we break down this like deep acceptance that isn't just at the elected level, but is at is at the day-to-day level. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. But so many people have not seen it, and have not internalized what the price is that people are paying. And there's a lot to do there.
Emily, want to hear from you too. What unexpected opposition did you see come up during the legislative session, and what do you want people to know about some of these bills that you were working on in response to that?
Yeah, I don't know that it's unexpected, but I'll just name one of the responses that I got, especially around the jaywalking bill, but I think in other on other issues as well that touch on what we're talking about. And that is that people actively shame you for imagining something different. When I talked about this, about 1428, people, very well-intentioned people who I agree with on a whole lot of issues, would say to me, how could you do this given the number of people who are dying in your district? And that's a hard thing to swallow, right? Because I do think often, tragically, about the people who are killed on bikes and who are killed as pedestrians in the district. I think about that. I feel it. I mourn for people, seeing the mother of 4 who was just killed in Soto in the district, walking across the street. These are painful, harmful things. But we shouldn't shame each other into doing the most politically expedient and ineffective solution. We should find the courage to do something else. And I will say that as a first-time legislator, I've spent some of my life in advocacy, working in advocacy, and that's where you say advocacy works, movement building works. But now that I'm a legislator, I would say advocacy works, movement building works, because the only antidote to shame is a vision of something better. I really think that's true. And to Vicki's point, the more that we can articulate that this is not a fait accompli, we don't have to live with what we see, there is a better solution, we can imagine coming together around it, the more courage and the less places to hide that elected officials have in making those decisions.
Jack, and then Anoka, would love to hear from your perspectives as well.
Yeah, so the first bit is like, hey, there were a lot of different visions of safety. And then the second bit of the question is, what was the unexpected opposition, saying to refresh myself. And, again, just trying to shift the conversation to looking at safety more holistically. There is this, I remember, maybe unexpected for me in like a really personal micro level, talking to my partner about the traffic safety bills. And as you can imagine, this is someone who normally agrees with me. And I said, hey, we're trying to get rid of jaywalking. Like it's let's do away with this, thinking he's going to be like rah rah. And he's like, won't people just be like running into the street and getting hit? And I was like, what? No. And it was a moment where I realized that is, to really go back to what you were saying, Representative Alvarado, like people have this set mindset about the way that things are just the way they must be. And that the only alternative to what we have right now is a sort of chaos. Like, obviously we have this law because people just want to run into the street. When in reality, most people want to cross the street safely. Most people are looking out for their own well-being and have the sense to handle that. And when you ask them, say when I'm again walking with my partner downtown and there's like a one-way street and there's no one coming and we're like, oh, let's just cross here. I'm like, see, it's fine. We're fine. So I think just the unexpected opposition from just folks who who still have to make that paradigm shift, and the grand opportunity to take someone's hand and like guide them to that, or through that, is just wonderful to experience and fun. But then also, if there's one thing that I really want people to know about, opposition that I don't know if it was unexpected, but it was new to me. What was a new understanding for me as someone who does pay attention to the session and does testify and whatnot, is the role that cities really play. Like if there's one thing that I could shout from the mountaintops to people who are getting involved with the legislature, I would say, did you know your city has a lobbyist? And did you know that that lobbyist does not work for you? They work for the city. They work for the city as an entity. They want to reduce that city's liability. And that means that anything that forces, change, forces public servants to learn a new way of doing their jobs, or has the potential to hold them accountable, is something that they're likely to push against. Even though as a citizen of your city, as a resident of your city, you want accountability from your public officials. You want your public officials to be open to new ways of handling their jobs, to be open to the best data and training there is. And so just like, be aware, your city has a lobbyist, and they don't work for you. They work for your city, the entity, as a legal body, and maybe make a ruckus during interim and ask your city what exactly it is that they're supporting and asking for in Olympia.
Just to piggyback on what Jack said, I think some of the things that were surprising were this idea that people are going to be driving without windshields if there wasn't this law, and it's like, nobody's going to do that. It's like, people do have their own personal interest in just driving, in a way that's not going to harm them, and then there's also a surprising argument that was coming from law enforcement that was that, oh, well, these really low risk stops, that's actually how we build trust. That's how we do community engagement. And it really sort of showed to me like the disconnect between their experience and how those stops are experienced, particularly by, I would say by all community members. I don't think there's a single person who leaves a traffic stop like, wow, that was great, but particularly by BIPOC community members and actually so many others. And so it's seeing that disconnect, and again, that sort of inability to imagine anything being different. And then I would say that some of the, I guess, expected opposition that we just got so much of was things like, oh, but we need, to stop people for a single taillight because that's how we found Timothy McVeigh, or, and this sort of like needle in a haystack, and it's literally like 1 in a million. And and time again, we could show people the data, like we're looking at 11 million traffic stops from Washington State Patrol. And the percentage of people found with contraband was less than 1%, that's less than, it was actually 0.27%, so it's like, in other words, 99.75% of these stops do not result in finding any sort of like more contraband, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that is almost the opposite, where it's like, even when we can show people the data of what's happening in our state, what's happening in other states, in terms of DUI, for example, DUI stops went up when these low risk equipment failure violations enforcement went down. Even if we can show people, it's like, you don't even have to use your imagination to imagine something different. Even when we can show you that this has succeeded, there is just so much resistance. And to me, it really showed how emotionally connected law enforcement are to the norm, and how many lawmakers want to support that status quo.
Well, thank you, everyone. Those are all the set questions, but we have received some awesome questions from some folks at registration and in the chat during our conversation. So we still have a little bit more time. So we'll start with some of the more commonly asked questions. If anyone just wants to jump in and take one, feel free. One of the first questions from our audience: what are your thoughts on automated enforcement in cases where legal limitations will protect Black, Indigenous, people of color, and non-car road users? What are the main equity considerations for automated enforcement?
I guess I'll jump in on that one. Automated enforcement is a weird thing, and I'll be honest, I don't know this very well from a policy angle, but I do know it a little bit from a personal angle, which is if you run a red light in Spokane, and the little light flashes and the picture's taken of you, and you get something in the mail, you know, a week later saying, oh, hey, you did this thing, you got a ticket, and it comes from Arizona, because automated enforcement is something that is by and large handled by just like a handful of companies in the whole of the United States. And so all the stops for millions of stops are going to Arizona, essentially. The data is being crunched there and that's being sent to you. So things that came to mind with that situation, which I 100% ran that red light. So this is not an issue where I was unjustly ticketed. But had I been, there wasn't an easy way for me to deal with it. It was a situation where there was no real person involved. And in some of these automated systems, there's no, on one hand, you don't touch the court system, or it's not very easy to touch the court system through them, which might be a good thing. By and large, I'm not here for criminal justice entanglement. But on the other hand, means that there is never like a person, or it's difficult to find that person who you appeal things to. And for someone who maybe doesn't have the resources, time, or energy, especially Black and brown and low income people, to deal with something or to contest something if they want to, and now they're just shelling out however many $100s for something, for a ticket, that can just feel like just, you know, it's being dumped on your day and you don't know who to talk to. So, I mean, that's the first thing that comes to mind. I also just wonder, and again, I want to be really transparent about how little I actually know about this issue. But I think it's worth noting that as we use automated systems and also as we use facial recognition, artificial intelligence and whatnot, we've seen over and over again that these systems, because they are only as good as how they are taught and tested, and they're often taught and tested with white people. So we find that facial recognition is actually less accurate for Black and brown people, which is, you know, some people say, well, great, they won't know who I am. Well, that also means that they're more likely to think that you're someone you're not. And if they're pursuing someone on, you know, criminal charges, they're pursuing someone, or law enforcement is pursuing someone perceived as dangerous, and automated systems are being used to find this person, there's a higher chance that a lot of innocent people who are not even the target of the search, are going to be wrapped up in that. And also just overall inaccurate data leads to, you know, poor decision-making based on that data, right? Like your decision-making is only as good as the data. So if the automated data is coming in poorly for a Black or brown person's face, or for our names, or, you know, other aspects of our size or anything else, that leads to decision-making that can harm us down the line. So that's what pops to mind, and maybe somebody more knowledgeable on the panel can comment.
I think, you know, some of our concerns around automated enforcement is just this investment in the surveillance state and increasing surveillance. I think is really problematic for many reasons that Jack alluded to. And so going back to something that Vicky actually raised is that if you look at sort of where in Seattle, for example, automated speed cameras are placed, it does sort of map onto where there's less investment and where there are sort of our communities of color. You know, it really stuck out to me that in Magnolia, for example, which is a largely white middle class community, there are no speed cameras around schools, you know, and things like that. But in South Seattle, where my kids go to school, there are, and it's like, wow, well, I clearly I think that was based on the number or frequency of accidents there. But instead of spending all of the money in creating a system to surveil that area, why aren't we spending money to invest in infrastructure in order to slow those areas down, those streets down, so that speeding isn't what people are geared towards? And that's just how our roads are made. And we could really see that during the pandemic when there are fewer cars on the road. You know, these roads are built for speed. And you know, without those sort of infrastructure changes that actually are sort of long-term investments in creating safety, and again, get people what they need, rather than just sort of going to like, we just need to enforce. And so I think there is equity issues in where these cameras are placed, but then also it just sort of are more reflections of problems of disinvestment rather than actual solutions.
Yeah, I'll chime in real quick, agreeing with what everything that's been said, but also this like perverse incentive piece around like, okay, so if a city is generating revenue through traffic cameras, where does that money go? Does it go into the general fund? Does it go specifically to improve streets? Like, what if it's in the general fund, like the city is increasingly, or the municipality is increasingly relying upon those funds, and the goal should really be to get to zero again, if you do have traffic cameras, to get rid of them and invest in the streets so they're actually safer.
Awesome. What work can we do in the interim to work directly with organizations that we think oppose some of these bills that we worked on, and try to find common ground and craft new versions to gain support to pass?
It's so soon after the legislative session. Everyone needs to take a breath. I think that's why no one's answering.
I say, for the traffic safety for all, I think having conversations with law enforcement, and we've been doing that, and continuing to have those conversations. But I think actually something that's even more effective is having some of that opposition talk to other, like having law enforcement talk to other law enforcement, and just because they can hear each other differently than they can hear the ACLU. But having those kinds of conversations and keeping it going, because for so many of these things, it's like the data is on the side of change, and it really is more about storytelling and gaining some understanding and education and familiarity with the possibility of change.
I guess I would add, and oh, sorry, Jack. I would add, and it might be a repeat of what I've said before, but for example, for 1428, for the Free to Walk bill, for I think some of the other bills, traffic safety for all, rights on red, some of the bills that have been talked about, these are bills that didn't even make it out of the first committee of their house of origin. This is not yet an issue of how do we find those most opposed and get them to work with us on negotiated solutions. This is about the big majorities of people who aren't yet comfortable with saying the kinds of solutions that we're talking about as real solutions. They're still scared of being shamed, of being laughed at, right? So I do believe this comes back a lot to proactive advocacy and messaging and partnership and communication with elected officials to build that will and vision and trust, because maybe then next session we make it one step farther. But these are bills that are now starting the conversation, and let's figure out how to keep pulling them across the finish line. I do also want to mention that, as others have said, we've been doing better on investment than we have on policy. And so even the introduction of the traffic safety bill did result in an investment in that grant program ending up in the transportation budget. So there is more comfort in the proactive investment, and then bringing people to the place where we can make those investments without the penalties too is the next place to get to.
Awesome. Well, we're at 11 o'clock. I want to thank all of our panelists today for sharing your perspectives and expertise. TCC, we are really excited to continue this work in the interim, and be ready to pass these bills on enforcement reform and systemic road safety improvements. All right. If you'd like to stay updated on TCC's work in the interim, please sign up for our newsletter using the link in the chat. We're also sharing links for the ACLU of Washington, Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane, Washington Bikes, the Representative Alvarado's office in the chat if you want to stay updated with their work. Finally, Give Big is next week. Support Transportation Choices Coalition this May 2nd and 3rd. We rely on the generous support of people like you to make this critical work possible. Please consider making a contribution. Every little bit helps, and all of that goes to us trying to get these bills passed. So thank you. all of you for joining us. Have a great rest of your day, and hope to see you at the next Transit Talk.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.